October air at 25,000 feet burned lungs like glass. On a freezing morning in 1943, high above central Germany, a B-17 Flying Fortress shuddered through turbulence as its four engines roared unevenly, each vibration rattling bone and nerve. Inside the aluminum fuselage, oxygen masks crusted with frost, fingers numbed inside thick gloves, and the smell of oil mixed with cold metal. Outside, black flak bursts blossomed like lethal flowers, and bright tracer rounds stitched glowing lines across the sky. The bomber was not alone. It was flying unnaturally close to its neighbors, wingtips almost aligned, prop wash buffeting the aircraft with violent insistence. One small error, one slip of concentration, and two planes would collide and fall together. This closeness was not panic, it was deliberate, it was the trick. By October 1943, American daylight bombing over Europe was bleeding crews at an unsustainable rate. Some missions were losing more than 20% of their aircraft in a single flight. Crews vanished faster than replacements could be trained. If this formation fractured, dozens of bombers and hundreds of young men would be dead before reaching the channel. Why were they flying like this, and why had commanders dismissed it as madness? Before the war hardened them into statistics, these men were ordinary professionals. In the late 1930s, the United States Air Corps was filled not with knights of the air, but with mechanics who smelled of grease, civilian pilots who had flown mail routes and crop dusters, engineers who trusted slide rules more than slogans, and barnstormers who understood instinctively how fragile an airplane really was. They believed in the B-17 Flying Fortress because it made mechanical sense. Bristling with .50 caliber machine guns, it was designed to defend itself, a fortress in motion that could fight its way to the target and back without fighter escort. On paper, the idea was elegant. In the air, the reality was unfinished. During training flights over the American plains, crews began noticing something unofficial. When aircraft drifted closer together than regulations preferred, something changed. Gunners felt less exposed. Attacks, real or imagined, seemed easier to repel. Overlapping arcs of fire created protection no single bomber could provide alone. No one wrote this down. There were no memos, no diagrams, no doctrine lectures. It was passed quietly between crews, mentioned in briefings, adjusted by inches and seconds. The idea was not born from theory, but from repetition and unease. These men were not rebels. They followed orders, trusted checklists, and respected hierarchy. But beneath that discipline lived a shared, unspoken understanding. Survival favored cooperation. Long before anyone called it a tactic, the logic of flying closer together was already taking shape inside their minds.
The official doctrine was simple and rigid. Bombers must fly loose formations, wings spaced widely, altitude stacks carefully staggered, each aircraft occupying its prescribed airspace. The reason, officers insisted, was clear. Tight formations invited collisions and concentrated flak, turning one misstep into a cascading disaster. Manuals warned repeatedly, any deviation from the prescribed spacing was both impractical and punishable. Senior commanders dismissed the very idea of flying closer together as reckless, labeling it dangerous, impractical, even suicidal. Instructors, echoing the hierarchy, shook their heads at murmured suggestions of tighter flight patterns. Bureaucracy added another layer of resistance. Every change required approval through layers of command. Airspace regulations forbade overlapping courses, training guidelines mandated strict separation, and crews knew that a single collision could result in court-martial. To the system, adherence to doctrine was synonymous with survival, yet ironically, rigid obedience often led to the opposite. Meanwhile, reality told a harsher story. Lone bombers, stragglers, or loosely grouped formations were being methodically hunted by the Luftwaffe. Experienced fighter pilots in Bf-109s and FW-190s exploited every gap, their coordinated attacks reducing once formidable flying fortresses to burning wreckage. Each mission underscored a brutal truth. Doctrine and survival were diverging paths. The men who had begun experimenting with closer formations were mocked quietly, their instincts dismissed as naive. Yet in that very instinct lay the seeds of a solution the hierarchy refused to recognize. For survival to improve, these men would have to challenge the very rules they were sworn to obey, risking reprimand, disbelief, and even death, simply to test a principle the system had already condemned. By 1943, the skies over Europe had become a lethal crucible. The combined bomber offensive aimed to cripple German industry through relentless daylight raids, striking factories, rail yards, and oil refineries. Yet the plan carried an inherent risk. Without long-range fighter escort, U.S. bombers flying deep into enemy territory were exposed for hundreds of miles, their massive aluminum frames glittering like targets under a merciless sun. The Luftwaffe had perfected the art of aerial ambush. Squadrons of Bf-109s and FW-190s attacked with disciplined precision, often striking head-on to exploit the bomber's frontal vulnerability. Concentrated bursts from 20mm and 30mm cannons tore through fuselage and wing alike, shredding crews' hope along with sheet metal. Enemy pilots coordinated attacks in overlapping patterns, forcing bombers into evasive maneuvers that left gaps for follow-on strikes. By mid-1943, the statistics were grim. On certain missions, loss rates approached 20%, meaning a single raid could wipe out an entire squadron of trained crews. Commanders faced a stark dilemma. If casualties continued at this pace, daylight bombing, the backbone of strategic pressure against Germany, would have to be abandoned. Thousands more airmen would perish unnecessarily, and the offensive itself risked collapse. In this cauldron of attrition and fear, desperation became fertile ground for innovation. The rigid rules of spacing and formation that had governed bomber operations suddenly clashed with the urgent need for
survival, setting the stage for a tactical idea that commanders once deemed madness, but which could determine who lived and who died. The solution, deceptively simple in concept, was known among the crews as the combat box. It was a formation designed not for elegance but for survival, a living, breathing sphere of overlapping firepower. Picture a medieval shield wall, row upon row of men presenting points of defense toward any attacker. Now imagine that wall lifted into the sky, steel and fabric replacing armor, machine guns replacing spears. Each B-17 was a node in this lattice, guns sweeping the airspace in arcs calculated to intersect with neighboring aircraft. A porcupine in flight, the collective defensive output far exceeded the sum of its parts. The technique required precise alignment. Bombers were stacked both horizontally and vertically, separated by mere hundreds of feet, wings slightly staggered to prevent mid-air collisions, yet close enough for guns to cover blind spots. A squadron would form a small wedge. Multiple squadrons would combine into a group, and groups would align into a cohesive wing. Communication was minimal and mostly nonverbal. Visual cues, shadowing the lead aircraft, and instinct honed in training. Each crew knew its relative position down to the second, and any lapse could compromise the protective lattice. Conventional doctrine had dismissed such proximity as suicidal. The risk of collision was real. Turbulence, pilot error, or flak damage could bring aircraft together in a lethal embrace. Yet the probability of survival in a tightly knit formation outweighed these risks. German fighters approaching any bomber faced overlapping streams of .50 caliber bullets from multiple directions, each trajectory calculated to intersect with the next. An attacking plane could no longer isolate a single target without running straight into another bomber's fire. The genius lay in its simplicity and adaptability. No new technology was required, only discipline and coordination. The human element became the force multiplier. Crews trained to maintain the pattern, adjust spacing on the fly, and react collectively to threats. What seemed like chaotic proximity was in fact a meticulously structured network of defensive zones. The combat box turned vulnerability into resilience, transforming a fragile aluminum bombers into a synchronized, nearly impenetrable defense. In theory, this was elegant. In practice, it was deadly effective. It was here, in these calculated inches of separation and overlapping arcs of fire, that the B-17's survival rate began to climb, proving that sometimes the simplest idea, boldly executed, could outmatch rigid doctrine and technological superiority. The first missions flown under deliberately tightened formations were tense experiments. Pilots adjusted their aircraft to maintain closer spacing than regulations dictated, and gunners trained their eyes along overlapping arcs of fire. Observers on the ground and in command towers watched nervously, convinced that the slightest miscalculation would result in catastrophic collisions. Among the crews themselves, whispers of doubt circulated. Could inches of difference in altitude and lateral spacing really make a difference against seasoned Luftwaffe pilots?
As the bombers penetrated deeper into enemy territory, the effects of the combat box became apparent. Stragglers were fewer. Wingmen covered blind spots with disciplined precision, and German fighters attempting isolated attacks were met with a torrent of overlapping fire from multiple directions. One by one, attackers were forced to break off, unable to find a vulnerable target. For the first time, measurable reductions in losses were recorded. Fewer planes fell behind, fewer men were lost, and the formation returned largely intact to base. It was not a perfect solution. Flak and enemy strategies still took their toll, but the principle had been validated. The tight formation worked. What had once been dismissed as reckless and suicidal proved to be a practical, repeatable tactic. This first engagement confirmed that coordinated, disciplined proximity was not just theory, it was survival, and it offered a glimmer of hope that doctrine and instinct could finally align to save lives in the relentless air war over Europe. The Luftwaffe did not remain passive. They studied the new American formations, analyzing patterns, timing, and gaps with cold precision. Soon, bomber groups encountered heavier weapons, including 30mm cannons capable of shredding fuselages with a single burst, and experimental air-to-air rockets designed to punch through defensive arcs. Coordinated group attacks became the norm. Waves of fighters would approach from multiple vectors simultaneously, forcing bomber crews into rapid, almost instinctive adjustments. Despite the tighter formations, losses continued. Planes still went down, engines caught fire, and crews were wounded. Yet, remarkably, the casualty rates were no longer catastrophic. The combat box had transformed peril into survivable risk, giving hundreds of men a fighting chance where previously there had been none. Within the formation, chaos became a fluid constant. Pilots adjusted altitudes by mere feet to avoid collision, gunners tracked incoming fighters while monitoring neighboring arcs, and navigators called out corrections to maintain cohesion. A damaged bomber could lose a wing panel or take a fuselage hit, yet remain protected by the concentrated fire of its squadron. Crews adapted mid-air, learning to anticipate the enemy and each other simultaneously. The formation itself became almost sentient, responding collectively to threats with disciplined precision. This was no simple tactic executed once and forgotten. Every mission was a trial by fire, a test of coordination, courage, and nerve. Each crew member needed absolute trust in their neighbors and in the invisible lines of defense threading the formation. Success was neither automatic nor guaranteed. It demanded continuous vigilance, split-second decision-making, and the endurance to maintain order under stress few civilians could imagine. Yet, with each mission, the pattern held. Each surviving squadron validated the principle further, demonstrating that human discipline, ingenuity, and courage could turn a vulnerable fleet into a formidable, synchronized weapon against even the most aggressive and adaptable Luftwaffe attacks. The stakes had risen, but so had the skills and confidence of the crews, setting the stage for the climactic moments that would prove the tactic's ultimate value. By the spring of 1944, the results of disciplined combat box formations were undeniable. On a series of missions between March and May, bomber loss rates over heavily defended targets dropped from nearly 20% to under 10%, a dramatic reduction that directly translated into saved lives. Hundreds of airmen who had previously been shot down, captured, or killed now returned to base, their aircraft intact, their crew whole. During one particularly harrowing raid over the industrial heart of central Germany, 70 B-17s pressed through relentless flak and fighter attacks. Not a single bomber fell out of formation. German fighters were repelled by intersecting fields of fire, their assaults blunted by the synchronized pattern in the sky. These missions proved beyond question that a simple adjustment in spacing and coordination could defy expectation, turning a slaughterhouse into a survivable operation. The simple trick had worked. Hundreds of men lived because they had flown closer together, trusting each other and the unseen geometry of defense their instinct and training had created.
The success of the combat box did not go unnoticed for long. Senior commanders who had once dismissed tight formations as reckless began to revise their assessments. Training manuals were updated to reflect the new reality, codifying spacing, altitude stacking, and squadron coordination as standard operating procedure. What had been scorned as madness was now doctrine. Pilots and gunners were instructed not only in how to fly these formations, but why they mattered, how collective precision could save lives and aircraft alike. Among the crews themselves, respect replaced skepticism. Quiet acknowledgments passed in briefings and hangars. The survival of entire squadrons was credited not to daring individuals or heroic stunts, but to the disciplined, coordinated effort of every member of the formation. The lesson was clear. Success came from cooperation and adherence to a carefully honed system, not luck or bravado. For the first time, the innovation that had been whispered about in training became a shared point of pride. The airmen who had risked their lives executing what once seemed absurd now flew with confidence, their trust in each other validated by the tangible proof of reduced losses and returned crews. The tide had shifted. Mockery was replaced with respect, and the combat box became a symbol of ingenuity triumphing over doubt. The disciplined use of combat box formations bought critical time for the Allies. As the U.S. Army Air Forces refined the tactic, loss rates stabilized just long enough for long-range fighter escorts, such as the P-51 Mustang, to accompany bombers deep into German territory. These escorts further reduced casualties, but it was the foundation laid by coordinated formations that made the integration effective. Without this collective defensive strategy, escort fighters would have arrived to reinforce vulnerable aircraft, not resilient squadrons capable of maximizing survival. The legacy of the combat box extended beyond World War II. Modern air combat doctrine continues to emphasize mutual support, formation integrity, and layered defensive zones. From jet fighter squadrons to transport convoys, the principle of overlapping coverage and coordinated response remains a fundamental strategy in both military planning and aerial combat.
Tactics. The innovation demonstrated that even simple adjustments, executed with precision and discipline, can have profound and lasting effects. The men who first implemented the combat box largely returned to quiet civilian lives. Pilots became engineers, mechanics returned to shops, and gunners resumed ordinary work, their heroism often unrecognized beyond the squadron. Yet their contribution endured in every formation flown thereafter, in every tactic designed to preserve life through cooperation. The invisible geometry of the combat box shaped not only the outcome of missions over Europe, but the philosophy of air warfare itself. What began as instinctive survival logic became a lasting testament to ingenuity, courage, and the power of disciplined teamwork in the face of relentless danger. Innovation rarely arrives with fanfare. Often it appears too simple, too unassuming to command trust, especially in the midst of chaos. The combat box was exactly that, a straightforward adjustment in spacing and coordination, yet its impact was profound, saving hundreds of lives and altering the course of aerial warfare. It stands as a sober reminder that ingenuity, discipline, and collective effort can triumph over both fear and entrenched convention. The story of these bomber crews is not merely a historical footnote, it is a testament to courage and cooperation under the most extreme conditions. Every return flight, every life preserved, was a product of shared trust and calculated risk. If this story moved you, help us keep such forgotten moments alive. Share family histories, comment with tales of unsung heroism, and subscribe to join our mission of uncovering the quiet acts of ingenuity that shaped history. Together, we ensure these lessons and the lives they preserved are never lost.